To April Blasio, life had always resembled a storybook. A loving mother, a father who crafted tales as a writer, and a warm, inviting home formed the foundation of her childhood. Yet, as the years passed, that idyllic life began to morph into an unimaginable nightmare. Faced with a horrifying revelation, April found herself grappling with a harrowing question. What would you do if your father was a serial killer? Would you remain silent, a mere observer in this twisted reality? Or would you summon the courage to confide in the authorities? This narrative revolves around Edward Wayne Edwards, a man whose name would earn a grim place on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1961. He was not only a notorious criminal, but also an author, penning a book on how to rebuild one's life after prison. April Blasio, a 40-year-old mother of 3, lay awake one night, her mind racing. The name of her childhood hometown echoed in her thoughts, compelling her to throw off the blanket and confront the past. Rising from her bed, she reached for her laptop and typed the words that would unravel a dark chapter of her life. Concord, Wisconsin Unsolved Case. It was 2009 when April began her desperate search for answers. A profound unease haunted her, a nagging feeling that something sinister had transpired in the quaint town where she had spent several formative months. She had been just 11 years old at the time. The first link she clicked revealed a chilling request for information about an unsolved case. The report detailed a horrific event that unfolded just months before April's family relocated. On August 9, 1980, young lovers Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew mysteriously vanished during a wedding reception. A wave of dread washed over April, as she instinctively sensed a connection to the tragedy that befell the couple. In that small town of Concord, Wisconsin, Timothy and Kelly's lives were tragically cut short. 19-year-old Timothy Hack and his girlfriend Kelly Drew had been happily navigating their relationship since high school. On that fateful day, they were excited to attend a wedding reception, dreaming of a bright future ahead. Timothy, with aspirations of becoming a farmer, proudly owned a tractor he affectionately called Lonely Loser. Meanwhile, Kelly had recently graduated from beauty school, eager to carve out a successful career. Arriving at the Concord house, the venue for their celebration, the couple danced joyfully, congratulating the newlyweds. They planned to join friends at another party later that evening. After 30 minutes of festivities, witnesses spotted Tim and Kelly leaving the building, yet they never made it to the next party and failed to return home that night. The search for the young lovers became urgent, leading investigators to Timothy's car, which sat locked in the parking lot of the Concord house. Inside, his wallet rested in plain sight, but there was no sign of the couple. As the hours turned into days, the couple's disappearance escalated into the largest manhunt in Wisconsin history. The discovery of physical evidence along the roadside shattered any remaining hope for their families. A pair of pants, brutally slashed from ankle to groin, was identified as belonging to Kelly Drew. Nearby lay her underwear, a piece of rope, and a section of yellow tubing, yet the bodies remained elusive. For 2 harrowing months, the young couple was missing. It was only when hunters roamed the forest that the truth began to unfold. The first grim discovery was Kelly's naked, decomposed body, with Timothy's body lying just 90 feet away. The horrific scene revealed that both victims had suffered immensely. Kelly's wrists, ankles, and neck bore the marks of ligatures. Strangulation had claimed her life. Multiple stab wounds marred her body, and the presence of seminal fluid on her clothing hinted at a brutal assault. Timothy, too, had met a violent end. He was stabbed in both the chest and back before strangulation followed. Investigators struggled to identify a motive or a suspect among the couple's acquaintances. As leads dwindled, the focus shifted to the staff of the Concord house, where the last joyful moments of the couple had unfolded. Among the staff, suspicion fell on one man, a handyman whose presence at the wedding reception would soon be scrutinized as the investigation deepened. In a chilling twist of fate, a man who worked at a tent camp near Concord house emerged as a person of interest. He was seen with blood smeared across his face the very weekend the young couple vanished. When detectives questioned him, they learned his name was Edward Wayne Edwards. Edward vehemently denied having ever entered Concord house or possessing any knowledge about the couple's disappearance. He insisted that the blood on his face was a result of a minor injury he suffered while deer hunting, a claim that at the time seemed plausible enough to investigators. Lacking any evidence to contradict his account, the detectives ultimately released Edward, leaving the case of the slain lovers shrouded in mystery. For the next 30 years, it remained unsolved, a haunting specter over the community. Then, in 2009, nearly 3 decades later, a breakthrough came when authorities received a tip from a woman named April Blasio. She boldly claimed to know who had taken the lives of the young couple back in 1980. Initially, detectives greeted April's statement with skepticism, suspecting she might be just another unstable individual seeking attention. However, they listened as she detailed her accusations against her own father. His name had surfaced in the case files, and he was listed in the police database. April revealed that she was the eldest of 5 siblings, recalling a troubling memory from her childhood. At just 11 years old in the 1980s, she vividly remembered the night her father returned home with a bloody nose and cuts on his face, claiming he had been in a fight. Yet, when police later questioned him, his story changed entirely. 2 days after that violent incident, Edward woke April in the dead of night, announcing that the family was moving. In hindsight, she perceived a chilling connection. Her father worked at the tent camp near Concord House, the last place the couple was seen alive. April's father was none other than Edward Wayne Edwards. As suppressed memories resurfaced, she began investigating various cases from that area, unknowingly drawing closer to the truth. Her search led her to an article about the unsolved case, which included a phone number for anyone with information to call. This prompted investigators to delve into Edward's past, uncovering that he had indeed moved his family shortly after the couple's disappearance. This move took place just after he had been questioned by police, raising further suspicions. To complicate matters, Edward had a long criminal history, which cast a dark shadow over his character and prompted detectives to scrutinize his background more closely. Edward Wayne Edwards was born in Ohio in 1933, and his troubled childhood began with the tragic loss of his mother, who took her own life. Following this devastating event, he was sent to an orphanage run by a monastery, where he suffered cruel treatment at the hands of the nuns, both physically and emotionally. This torment likely influenced his later criminal behavior. At 18, Edward enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, but lasted only a short time before fleeing and receiving a dishonorable discharge. He meandered through various odd jobs, a doctor, a vacuum cleaner salesman, a handyman, and a loader. But his life was veering into chaos. During this turbulent period, Edward fell deeper into the criminal underworld. His first arrest came in 1955, but after escaping prison, he embarked on a crime spree, robbing gas stations across the country. His brazen acts did little to conceal his identity, leading to another arrest for impersonating a federal officer. Despite being captured again, Edward managed to escape before authorities could fully grasp the extent of his evasion of justice. By 1961, he had earned a spot on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, a testament to his notoriety. Captured in 1962, he was sentenced to a maximum security prison, where he served 5 years before being released on parole in 1967. Edward claimed that his transformation was inspired by a benevolent guard who had guided him toward redemption. Upon gaining his freedom, he married and attempted to rebrand himself as a motivational speaker, making television appearances and even penning an autobiography titled Criminal Metamorphosis. In his book, The True Life Story of Ed Edwards, he raised critical issues and shared personal experiences that served as warnings to the youth. He reflected on the ease with which one could slip into trouble, contrasting it with the daunting difficulty of escaping its clutches. Edward emphasized the dire need for communication between parents and children, arguing that children crave words of love rather than strict discipline or persuasion. His memories of a troubled childhood underscored this plea. When questioned about his whereabouts, he insisted he had never set foot in Concord House, claiming that a nosebleed he suffered was merely a consequence of a minor injury from a deer hunting trip. Despite the investigators finding no evidence to contradict his claims, they released Edward and continued their inquiries. For 3 long decades, the case of the slaying lovers remained shrouded in mystery, unsolved and haunting. Then, in 2009, a breakthrough came when authorities received a tip from a woman named April Blasio. She claimed to know the identity of the killer responsible for the young couple's deaths in 1980. Initially met with skepticism, April's statement piqued the detectives' interest. April accused her own father, a name that appeared in the case files and was already in the police database. She divulged that she was the eldest of 5 siblings, revealing a family connection to the chilling events of the past. In his narrative, Edward recounted that he was originally named Charles Murray at birth. Following the death of his mother, he was adopted by the Edwards couple, who subsequently changed his name. Edward lived with his adoptive parents for only 3 years before they decided they could no longer care for him, leading to his placement in the orphanage. In his book, he devoted an entire chapter to the harsh treatment inflicted by the nuns overseeing the orphans. For instance, when Edward wet his bed, they forced him to endure icy cold showers as punishment. Edward Wayne. Edwards faced a harsh existence in the orphanage. Punished for the slightest infractions, he endured the torment of being forced outside in the rain. Desperate for freedom, he made about 15 attempts to escape his grim surroundings. When asked about his aspirations for the future, the young boy chillingly declared his intent to become a con man. Theft quickly became a way of life for him. A concerned nun eventually reached out to Edward's grandmother, expressing her fears about his behavior and suggesting he needed psychiatric help, as he was negatively influencing the other children. Ultimately, at the tender age of 12, Edward was expelled from the orphanage. He was sent to live with his grandmother, where he began attending public school. However, the change in environment did little to alter Edward's troubling behavior. He continued to steal money and cigarettes from unsuspecting passers-by, unfazed by the consequences. One fateful day, while loitering at the church door, he spotted a woman pleading for donations to buy flowers for a relative's funeral. Seizing the opportunity, Edward concocted a story of his own. He began telling the congregation that his grandmother had recently died, and as an orphan, he needed funds to buy flowers for her grave. This deceitful act escalated, and soon he found himself stealing larger items, often attracting the attention of law enforcement. During his teenage years, his character began to shift dramatically. Minor irritations would send him into uncontrollable rages, a troubling reflection of his inner turmoil. His grandmother, concerned for her grandson, explained that he had inherited his father's violent tendencies, a man Edward had no memory of. Before long, this young troublemaker was expelled from school for inciting chaos among his classmates in church. Disinterest in education led him to take a job at a local bowling alley, where he indulged in reckless behavior, including pulling fire alarms just to watch firefighters rush to the scene. This thrill-seeking became his twisted definition of entertainment. Amidst this chaos, Edward's attention turned to a 26-year-old neighbor who lived across the street, a figure who would soon become part of the unsettling narrative that surrounded his life. As a child, Edward had a penchant for mischief, often persuading his classmates to disrupt church services. School was never a priority for him, leading him to find work at a local bowling alley where he reveled in chaos, pulling fire alarms and watching firefighters rush to the scene, deriving a thrill from the disorder he caused. One day, Edward's attention was captured by a 26-year-old neighbor living across the street, setting the stage for a life filled with deception and destruction. In a quiet neighborhood, a single mother of 2 children found herself living under the watchful gaze of an unsettling presence. Every night, a man in a dry cleaning truck would pull up to her home, leaving his vehicle parked in the dimly lit lot, only to depart from the neighbor's residence at the break of dawn. Under the cloak of darkness, Edward Wayne Edwards crept silently towards the parked car, evading detection. With a flick of a match, he ignited the vehicle, watching as flames engulfed it in a fiery spectacle. Once the inferno took hold, he fled the scene, returning home. This act of arson would not go unnoticed, and the repercussions were imminent. The detective assigned to the arson case quickly connected the dots, honing in on the young culprit behind the flames. Edward was soon taken from his grandmother's home and sent to a reform school for boys, a place meant to curb the reckless behavior of troubled youth. At just 15 years old, escape from the confines of the reform school felt like a distant dream. However, it was there that Edward learned the ins and outs of crime, picking up skills like car theft and check forgery from fellow juvenile offenders. By the age of 17, Edward earned a release from the juvenile facility only to enlist in the U.S. Marine Corps. He passed the entrance exams, but soon realized that military life would require dedication to studying and that young recruits like him would not see combat. Disillusioned, he absconded, returning home without permission. Once back in his hometown, Edward donned a military jacket adorned with ribbons, relishing the attention it drew. He spun tales of valor and heroism, claiming to be on leave from deployment, basking in the admiration of those around him. As congratulations and accolades poured in, Edward's criminal tendencies resurfaced. He stole a car, and when apprehended, he boasted of his supposed military service. Although his fingerprints were absent from any records, law enforcement transferred him to military authorities for further scrutiny. In a moment of clarity, Edward vowed never to commit another crime. Yet, deep down, he plotted his next moves, determined to avoid capture in future vehicle thefts. He received a 5-year probation sentence, a token consequence for his burgeoning criminal career. However, the Marine Corps soon learned of Edward's past, leading to his dishonorable discharge. As he searched for work, he embellished his resume, claiming to have served in combat. He regaled colleagues with fabricated tales of heroism, only to later confess in his autobiography that he had misled everyone. Had Edward's life not been riddled with deceit, perhaps his story could have been truly engaging. But the truth remained. All the accounts documented in his book were steeped in falsehoods, as he later admitted to being a habitual liar throughout his life. By 1982, after grappling with convoluted musings on morality, Edward resumed his life of crime. He found himself behind bars once more, this time serving a 2-year sentence in Pennsylvania for arson. It was during this time that he received a troubling call from a former girlfriend named Linda, who confided in him about her assault. In his criminal metamorphosis, Edward reflected on the nature of coercion in sexual acts. He dismissed the crime as nonsensical, convinced that women were plentiful and willing to engage without pressure. In stark contrast to his claims, Edward had a history of manipulating young women, luring them away from their homes only to abandon them for new conquests during his tumultuous youth. Edward's life was marked by a string of relationships, punctuated by frequent stints in prison. He was charged with kidnapping, car theft, robberies, and burglaries, yet he managed to evade lengthy sentences, often emerging unscathed from armed robberies. He adhered to a personal code, claiming in his writings that he would only pull the trigger if the weapon was aimed at the victim's legs, insisting that he had no desire to inflict harm. For Edward, the thrill lay in recognition and the allure of money. Throughout his criminal exploits, one woman held a special place in his heart: Janet. She sat beside him as he robbed gas stations, their bond intensifying when she revealed her pregnancy. Just as their lives began to intertwine, Edward was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. While Edward served his time, Janet gave birth to a son. Initially, she settled in a house directly across from the prison, ensuring that Edward could catch glimpses of her and their child through the window, maintaining a fragile connection despite the bars that separated them. Despite his life of crime, Edward Wayne Edwards always seemed to escape the clutches of justice, even as he committed armed robberies. He adhered to a twisted moral code, claiming in his writings that he vowed to pull the trigger only if the weapon was pointed at a victim's legs. He insisted that he never wanted to inflict physical harm. For Edward, the thrill of the game lay in the recognition and monetary gain. Throughout his criminal escapades, only one woman, Janet, had ever truly captivated him, leaving a lasting mark on his tumultuous journey. The heart of Edward's reckless life was captured by a woman named Janet. While he orchestrated gas station heists, she remained behind the wheel, an accomplice in both crime and love. The dynamics shifted dramatically when Janet revealed she was pregnant, a revelation that coincided with Edward's arrest for his crimes. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. While Edward languished in his cell, Janet gave birth to their son. Determined to keep the father connected to his child, she settled in a house directly across from the prison, allowing Edward to catch glimpses of his family from his window. After years of feeling trapped in an unbearable situation, Janet made the heart-wrenching decision to write a final letter to Edward Wayne Edwards. With her son in tow, she vanished, leaving no trace behind. Furious at her abandonment, Edward's thoughts turned dark. He began plotting his escape, driven by a desire for revenge against his wife, who had turned her back on him. In a desperate bid for freedom, Edward attempted to dig a tunnel from his prison cell. Yet, fate intervened as the earth collapsed, burying his hopes. His second escape attempt met the same fate, and just to add insult to injury, Janet sent him divorce papers, effectively severing their ties. In 1959, after serving 4 years behind bars, Edward was extradited to Portland to face charges for 2 armed robberies. The judge, surprisingly lenient, sentenced him to 5 years of probation, granting him a sliver of freedom. Once released, Edward's first order of business was to track down Janet. To his dismay, he discovered she had remarried. As he lurked in the shadows, watching her from a car window, he spotted their son. An unexpected pang of emotion surged within him, but it was fleeting. Abandoning his vengeful plans, Edward chose to leave Janet in peace. He soon entered into a new marriage with Marlene, who remained blissfully unaware of her husband's criminal past. To maintain his facade, Edward spun an elaborate tale, claiming he worked in the criminal investigation department. He told Marlene that his previous incarceration was merely a distant memory, a cover for his current life. Edward's visits to his parole officer were cleverly disguised as secret meetings with fellow investigators, and Marlene, trusting and naive, never questioned his story. They married and enjoyed a seemingly normal life until Edward's world came crashing down in 1960. In a shocking turn of events, he was arrested again, this time facing scrutiny over a series of arsons and the brutal slaying of a young couple, Larry Payton and Beverly Allen. 19-year-old Larry had been found in his car, his body riddled with stab wounds. A month later, the body of his girlfriend, Beverly, surfaced. Her death ruled a strangulation. Edward's presence at the crime scene, coupled with a gunshot wound on his arm, raised suspicions. Investigators believed he was connected to the couple's deaths and pressed him for information on Beverly's whereabouts, as she remained missing. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Edward. He sensed that this time mere probation would not suffice. Desperate to escape the tightening noose of justice, Edward devised a plan. He convinced a friend to impersonate his probation officer, a ruse that astonishingly succeeded, allowing him to slip away once more. As authorities struggled to pin him down, Edward and Marlene embarked on a cross-country journey, evading law enforcement at every turn. The couple managed to elude capture until January 1962. Eventually, Edward was apprehended in his hometown, and Marlene faced charges as his accomplice, accused of aiding him in his criminal undertakings. Following his arrest, authorities collected Edward's DNA to investigate his potential involvement in the murders of Larry and Beverly. Surprisingly, the DNA did not match, yet a mountain of charges loomed over him, including multiple prison escapes. Edward's desperation led him to attempt another escape, this time fashioning a makeshift rope from 14 tied-together sheets, hoping to break free once more. However, a devastating blow struck when Edward learned that Marlene, now behind bars, was pregnant. Facing the reality of impending fatherhood, he found himself cornered, forced to strike a deal with investigators to plead guilty in exchange for her release during the trial. When Edward stood before the judge, he pleaded for leniency, but his request was met with firm rejection. The judge reminded him that he had already experienced more than enough leniency throughout his tumultuous life. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In addition to the lengthy prison term, he received an extra year for his attempted escape. The setbacks continued as news arrived that Marlene had lost the baby. Her heart hardened against the man who had deceived her at every turn. Edward's sentence led him to spend 16 years in a maximum security federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Reflecting on his life behind bars, he claimed that this experience transformed him. He immersed himself in education, attending classes in carpentry, bricklaying, and plumbing, seeking redemption in the confines of his cell. Edward's troubles continued as he received an additional year for an attempted escape. Yet, the most devastating blow came when his wife Marlene lost their baby. Heartbroken and betrayed by Edward's constant lies, she severed ties with him, unwilling to endure the pain any longer. Edward served a total of 16 grueling years in the maximum security federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He later claimed that this sentence transformed him. He immersed himself in carpentry, bricklaying, and plumbing classes, even earning a high school diploma, something he had never achieved as a child. For good behavior, he was granted parole after 5 years. At 34, Edward emerged from prison with a renewed sense of purpose and a determination to reshape his life. He reinvented himself as a motivational speaker, traveling to churches, schools, and making appearances on television. In 1968, he married Kay, a woman who would soon become pregnant during their honeymoon. The following year, their daughter April was born, followed by 3 more children. In his writings, Edward expressed no pride in his past but refused to hide away, seeking instead to prove himself worthy of redemption. He longed for society's acceptance, hoping to demonstrate that he could be a responsible citizen. Publishers of his book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, praised his apparent transformation, insisting that he had become a law-abiding citizen and a model for others. In their eyes, Edward had successfully turned his life around, becoming a devoted father and a published author. But beneath the surface, the truth simmered, waiting for its moment to emerge. 8 years after his sensational autobiography, Edward Wayne Edwards would reveal a darkness that belied his claims of change. In a shocking turn, he brutally murdered a young couple deeply in love. April Bellazio, a 40-year-old mother of 3, later shared with police that her own mother had once worked as a schoolteacher before her fate intertwined with Edward's twisted legacy. After the wedding, Kay was forced to abandon her teaching career. Edward, her domineering husband, insisted she focus solely on their children, disliking her time spent at work. Their lives became a constant shuffle, moving from place to place. Between 1974 and 2009, during the periods Edward was not incarcerated, the family drifted through more than 10 different states. Wherever they settled, Edward forged connections with local police, often inviting officers to their barbecues. April recalled that during family gatherings, her father displayed an unsettling obsession with the FBI. He hoarded documents in a dresser drawer, a place off limits to the family. The Edwards children were led to believe their father was an informant, a revelation that put their family in peril. This constant threat was the reason for their frequent relocations. April, the eldest daughter, described Edward's volatile temper. He unleashed verbal and physical abuse upon both his wife and children. Fortunately, she escaped the oppressive home life right after graduating high school. Having lived apart from her family for several years, haunting childhood memories plagued her. Driven by a desire for closure, she took to the internet, seeking answers to the shadows of her past. Years later, Her search for clarity about their transient childhood led her to an unsolved case involving two lovers. This pivotal moment brought April Blasio to the police station, hoping to uncover the truth. Upon hearing April's account, detectives decided to investigate the information she provided. They visited a mobile home where 76-year-old Edward Wayne Edwards resided at the time. The detectives encountered an overweight man tethered to an oxygen tank. Edward expressed surprise at the police's unexpected visit. The investigators quickly reassured him, framing their inquiry as a routine questioning regarding an old crime. They explained that many years prior, Edward had been near the crime scene. Calm and collected, he appeared more curious than concerned, often turning the questions back on the detectives when they inquired about the blood on his face. In a moment of apparent forgetfulness, Edward fabricated a tale about a failed hunting trip, claiming he had merely injured himself in his shed. However, when asked to provide a DNA sample to eliminate him as a suspect, his demeanor shifted noticeably. A wave of anxiety washed over him as he rambled about wrongful convictions, citing a television program about DNA mix-ups. He insisted he wanted no trouble in his old age. Eventually, Edward consented to provide a sample only after the detectives presented him with a warrant. His wife, Kay, appeared bewildered, unable to grasp why Edward hesitated to comply, believing there was no reason for concern. Kay informed the officers that she had no recollection of the crime involving the two lovers, and declined to answer further questions. However, after 5 weeks, in a desperate attempt to clear the air, she found herself compelled to speak with the detectives. This pivotal moment came after DNA evidence linked her husband to the tragic death of Kelly Drew, with a perfect match found on the clothing of the deceased, dating back to July 30th, 2009. Edward Wayne Edwards was finally apprehended for the murders of the young couple and swiftly extradited to Wisconsin. As investigators combed through his mobile home, they uncovered a trove of incriminating evidence, tapes, a meticulously kept notebook filled with dates, forged documents, social security cards, birth certificates, and a laptop that revealed Edward had conducted searches related to DNA following the detective's inquiry. Among the tapes, Edward had recorded his life in chilling detail. He had a penchant for documenting childhood memories, phone conversations with police, and even his own confessions of crimes committed. During an extensive interrogation regarding the events in Wisconsin, Edward admitted to knowing Kelly Drew, revealing that they had shared intimate moments. Yet, he insisted that their relationship had always been consensual. For the next 8 hours, he adamantly claimed he had never taken a life, a statement that contradicted the evidence mounting against him. The investigators, keenly aware of Edward's deceptive nature, observed his body language closely. His gestures, as he spoke, betrayed him. He would stretch out his arm when fabricating details, only to retract it back to his shoulder, a telltale sign of his dishonesty. As the grim reality of the test results was relayed to April Blasio, she was driving, overwhelmed by emotion. Pulling over to the side of the road, she stepped out of the car, desperate to shield her children from witnessing her turmoil. The shock enveloped her, despite having previously expressed her deep suspicions about her father. For April, the notion that her father could be involved in such a heinous crime was an unfathomable truth. She chose to remain silent, avoiding reporters and waiting anxiously for 8 months until the trial commenced, all the while her father, Edward, stubbornly refused to acknowledge his role in the murders of the young lovers. In his narrative, Edward claimed that he and Kelly Drew had met at a wedding reception, where they decided to escape the festivities in a car while her boyfriend, Timothy Hack, was preoccupied discussing his tractor. Caught up in a heated argument, Timothy was oblivious to Kelly's departure. As tensions escalated, Edward recounted witnessing the couple's fierce disagreement. Timothy, he claimed, had pushed Kelly, prompting Edward to intervene. In a moment of misguided bravery, Edward seized Timothy by the neck, intending to defuse the situation. At that time, he was still strong, capable of overpowering the younger man. Yet when he released his grip, Timothy collapsed, lifeless on the ground. Edward insisted that he never meant to extinguish the young man's life. It had been a tragic accident, a desperate attempt to protect Kelly. But instead of gratitude, Kelly lashed out at Edward, screaming in anguish over Timothy's death. In a panic, Edward's hands found their way around her neck, and he too silenced her cries. Realizing the enormity of his actions, Edward was faced with a grim decision. He couldn't leave the bodies near the wedding celebration. Loading them into his work van, he drove deep into the woods, far from prying eyes, where the shadows concealed his crime. In that secluded darkness, Edward's life as a husband and father hung in the balance. Fearful of losing everything in an instant, he concealed the evidence and relocated his family to another town, away from the horrors he had committed. Far from the scene of the crime, he understood the consequences of his actions. Prison loomed on the horizon, a reality he could no longer escape. The thought of spending his remaining years behind bars was suffocating, a fate he had never anticipated. Wisconsin lacked the death penalty, which meant Edward would face a long sentence. It was a grim prospect, one that weighed heavily on him as he recalled the life he had once known. Yet, even during his previous incarcerations, he had held on to the hope of freedom. Now the walls of a prison cell felt like a living tomb, suffocating and unyielding. Edward Wayne Edwards faced the chilling reality of his choices, fully aware that his past had irrevocably marked his future. And as the trial approached, the weight of evidence against him seemed insurmountable, casting a long shadow over the man he once was and the monster he had become. Edward's fate now rested in the hands of the justice system, while the memories of his past haunted him, each one a reminder of the lives he had shattered in his wake. And as he awaited his reckoning, the specter of his actions loomed large, a chilling reminder that some choices are irrevocable, sealing one's fate forever. Edward Wayne Edwards, a man once driven by the illusion of control, now faced the stark reality of his own making, a life defined by darkness and regret. Edward Wayne Edwards received 2 consecutive life sentences, yet deep within, he yearned for the death penalty. In a disturbing letter to the Norton Police Department in Ohio, he expressed his twisted desire for capital punishment. Instead, he confessed to a far graver crime, one that he believed would surely warrant his execution. In a haunting revelation, Edward disclosed that, back in 1977, 5 years after penning his memoir, he had sent a young couple to their untimely end. Their names were William Lavaco and Judith Straub, and the grim events unfolded in Sterling, Ohio. William, just 21, was an unassuming young man, while his girlfriend Judith, at 18, was merely a victim of circumstance. On August 8, 1977, Edward tracked William down at a local bar. He had repeatedly warned the young man to cease his flirtations with his daughter, delivering threats that William arrogantly dismissed. That fateful evening, Edward pedaled his bicycle to the bar, concealing himself in the shadows of an alley, waiting for the moment to strike. Inside the car, William and Judith could be heard arguing, their voices tinged with tension, threatening one another with a weapon. Edward had warned William multiple times that he would eventually come to harm, but the young man dismissed Edward's threats. That evening, Edward pedaled his bicycle to the bar, a sinister shadow trailing behind him. In a dimly lit, secluded alley, the scene was set for a chilling confrontation. There, hidden among the bushes, Edward Wayne Edwards lay in wait, poised for violence. Inside a parked car, William Lavaco and his girlfriend could be heard arguing, their voices rising with threats, the air thick with tension. In a brutal act of violence, Edward forced William out of the vehicle, intent on dragging him deep into the forest. Judith, oblivious to the impending horror, followed blindly. Edward shot the young couple at close range. Had William not uttered Edward's name, Judith might have escaped the nightmare, still shrouded in darkness. However, William made a fatal misstep, offering money and invoking Edward's name aloud. This mistake would seal both their fates. April, Edward's eldest daughter, recalled how often William had visited their home, conducting business with her father. One day, he just vanished, and soon after the entire family fled town. Edward was never questioned about William's disappearance. In his confession, he claimed to suspect that William had inappropriately touched April. Instead of reporting it to the authorities, he took matters into his own hands, later expressing remorse over Judith Straub's tragic end. Investigators were left in disbelief until April herself confirmed the chilling truth. She had never shared the details of her harassment with anyone and was completely unaware that her father had known. Could it be that her father was not the monster he appeared to be? Perhaps he was merely a protective parent. In 2010, Edward Wayne Edwards confessed to a crime committed over 30 years prior. Once again, he received 2 life sentences. But this revelation was not the conclusion of his twisted tale. In a moment of chilling honesty, he confided to his cellmate that his confessions were merely a strategy to land on death row. He lamented that had he known his admissions would only lead to additional life sentences, he would have kept his mouth shut. In a prison interview, Edward went further, recounting another slaying to a reporter. In 1993, with his children grown and gone, Edward encountered a young man named Danny Gluckner, a former classmate of his youngest daughter. Danny, having spent most of his life in foster care, was taken in by Edward and his wife Kay, who, unable to adopt him due to their age, changed his last name to Edwards. To them, he was Danny Boy. Initially, their relationship flourished. Danny felt like a son. However, just 3 years later, tragedy struck when Edward shot him. Edward's insatiable greed drove him to plot against his foster son. Viewing Danny as a potential source of wealth, he spent a year devising a plan that revolved around Danny Boy's life insurance policy. The young soldier had enlisted in the army and signed a $250,000 policy before going AWOL. Edward lured him to a forest near their home in Burton, Ohio, under the pretense of retrieving cigarettes from a bag. When Danny bent down, Edward unleashed a torrent of bullets, shooting him twice in the shoulder and chest. Affectionately known as Danny Boy, he was once embraced as a son by Edward and his wife. However, that bond would shatter 3 years later, in 1996, when Edward turned the gun on him. Driven by a relentless desire for money, Edward sought a way to enrich himself and his family, preferring schemes that required little effort. In Danny, he saw an opportunity, a path to financial gain through betrayal. For a year, he weighed his options, plotting his next move. Ultimately, he fixated on Danny Boy's life insurance policy, a staggering $250,000 that the young soldier had signed before going to serve in the army. Manipulating Danny's trust, Edward convinced him to go AWOL, a decision that would seal his fate. On that fateful day, Edward drove Danny to a secluded forest near Burton, Ohio. Under the guise of a casual outing, he asked his foster son to retrieve cigarettes from the bag. As Danny bent down, Edward unleashed a torrent of betrayal, shooting him twice, once in the shoulder and once in the chest. After committing the heinous act, Edward Wayne Edwards callously left his foster son's body in a shallow grave, ensuring its eventual discovery. In a chilling display of manipulation, he smeared Danny Boy's blood on his house window, then called the police, alleging that his foster son had attempted to rob them. This 911 call effectively shielded him from suspicion for months. Edward, ever the opportunist, returned to the gravesite, compelled to check if the body had been found. Edward had intentionally left the grave partially uncovered, a detail that would prove disastrous. One day, as he approached the site, he was met with a grotesque sight. Animals had disturbed the remains, leaving Danny's head severed from his torso. In a desperate act of concealment, Edward took the skull and discarded it in a nearby field. Days later, Danny Boy's remains were discovered by an unsuspecting hunter. Remarkably, Edward was not called in for questioning, as authorities believed the young man had attempted to rob the family that had taken him in, only to fall victim to a tragic fate. In a calculated move to profit from his foster son's death, Edward forged his wife's signature to secure an insurance payout. Kay had no knowledge of the policy or her husband's sinister actions. Now the cunning killer made a chilling proposition to investigators. He promised to reveal the location of Danny's head, but only if he received a death sentence. This marked the end of his lethal spree, or so he claimed. However, the police remained skeptical, suspecting that Edward harbored many more victims. In a startling confession, he admitted to murdering 5 individuals, 2 couples in love, and his beloved foster son. His daughter, April, could provide insight into various locations across states where they had lived, where several unsolved crimes lingered, possibly linked to her father. Whispers around the investigation suggested that Edward Wayne Edwards could be the infamous Zodiac Killer, a shadowy figure responsible for terrorizing young couples in California during the 1960s and 70s. The suspected victim count attributed to him could soar to 14 lives lost. In March 2011, Edward finally faced the consequences of his actions. He appeared in court, wheeled in due to various health issues, including diabetes and obesity. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murder of Danny Boy, with the execution date set for August 31st. Yet fate had other plans for the notorious criminal. On April 6, 2011, Edward Wayne Edwards succumbed to natural causes in his prison cell at the age of 77, never to meet his appointed end. His daughter, April, now burdened with the weight of her father's dark legacy, dedicated her life to uncovering the truth behind his other crimes. Haunted by the knowledge that she harbored suspicions of his guilt, yet failed to act, April was left to grapple with her decisions. She believed that perhaps, if she had reported her concerns to the authorities sooner, she could have saved other lives from the clutches of her father's malevolence. Thank you for watching. Support our new channel by catching our latest video or revisiting past episodes. Until next time. The grim tally of Edward's victims is believed to reach as high as 14 individuals, a staggering figure that paints a chilling portrait of his depravity. In March 2011, he finally confronted the consequences of his actions, appearing in court in a wheelchair, a stark contrast to the man who once wielded power over life and death. Suffering from a multitude of serious health issues, including diabetes, obesity, and breathing difficulties, Edward was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murder of Danny Boy. The execution date was set, a final chapter looming on the horizon, targeted for August 31st. In 2011, the notorious criminal Edward Wayne Edwards eluded justice until the very end. On April 6, 2011, he passed away from natural causes in his prison cell, leaving behind a legacy of terror at the age of 77. His daughter, April Balacio, dedicated a significant part of her life to unveiling her father's hidden crimes. Plagued by distress, she harbored deep guilt for not reporting her suspicions to the police sooner, convinced that her timely action could have saved countless lives. In the shadows of her father's infamy, her heart ached with the haunting thought of what